He is seated in his correct seat. Valid ticket. VIP seat. No noise, no disturbance. But simply because someone else was unhappy, he was asked to stand up. Not for safety reasons, not for technical reasons, but because it will be more convenient for everyone. If it were you, what would you do? Will you stand up to avoid trouble, or will you sit still knowing that even a small choice can change how others perceive you? The man chose not to stand up, not to raise his voice, not to argue. He simply remained calmly seated in his place, and from that moment everything began to fall apart. His true identity gradually came to light. The system began to tremble. Those who had once been confident fell silent. But the most painful question isn't, who is he? Instead, the question is, what would happen if he wasn't the CEO? If you've ever been looked down upon because of your appearance, if you've ever had to remain silent to be left alone, then this story is for you. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me in this story. A story that's not just about a chair, but about human dignity. Nobody on that flight knew his name. They saw only a tall, well-built black man, probably in his early 40s, standing silently in front of the VIP seats in the front cabin of the plane. He was wearing a dark jacket with frayed cuffs, dark blue jeans, and soft, non-glossy leather shoes. On his shoulder was an old canvas bag, the kind often seen on long overnight flights, when passengers just want to get the journey over with. The flight attendant's voice rang out, soft but sharp enough to break the silence. "Sir, please leave this seat." The man looked up, slowly, without surprise, without confusion, just a very calm gaze. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and even. The flight attendant glanced quickly toward the aisle where a white woman stood with her arms crossed, her eyes cold. Then she turned back, maintaining her professional smile. "This seat has been assigned to another passenger. We will arrange a different seat for you." He looked down at the boarding pass in his hand. Seat 1A. Bold, clear, no mistake. He didn't argue, nor did he get up immediately. In those brief seconds, old memories resurfaced, not loudly, not violently, just a painfully familiar feeling, the feeling of being overlooked, the feeling of being judged before being listened to, the feeling of having to prove that you are worthy. His name is Daniel Carter, and he lived with that feeling for almost his entire life. Daniel was born in South Chicago, in a neighborhood where children learn to be quiet sooner than they learn to dream. His father once said to him when Daniel was 12, "You have to be twice as good to be recognized half as well." Daniel remembered that phrase every time he walked into a room where he was the only black person. Every time he put on a suit and stepped up to the podium to give a presentation, only to be asked, "Are you an assistant?" Every time he sat in a conference room where people believed louder voices were more important than sound reasoning. He learned not to react immediately. He learned to breathe. He learned to let others reveal their true nature. And today, on a flight from JFK, New York to London, he faced that same old test again. Daniel flies solo. No assistants, no bodyguards. No one calls him sir or CEO. He likes it that way. After decades of living in stressful meetings, he cherishes these moments of anonymity. This VIP seat isn't a privilege, it's a necessity. He needs the space to work to prepare for tomorrow morning's meeting. A meeting that could change an entire industry if everything goes according to plan. But those things weren't reflected on his face. They weren't reflected in the clothes he was wearing. They weren't reflected in the eyes of the people looking at him right now. The white woman took a step forward. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the familiar impatience of someone accustomed to having their needs met. Daniel turned to look at her. His gaze was neither challenging nor contemptuous. It was simply a human gaze. "Can you tell me why I have to leave my seat?" he asked. She gave a wry smile. "Because you're sitting in the wrong place." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I don't think so." The atmosphere in the airplane cabin changed, subtle but noticeable. A few other passengers looked up. Some pretended to look at their phones. Others stared straight ahead, curious. The flight attendant began to get impatient. "Sir, please cooperate so that the flight can depart on time." The word cooperation hung in the air. Daniel understood perfectly well what it could turn into if he said one wrong thing. He looked out the window. The pale gray sky of early morning in New York. Luggage trucks moved slowly below. A very familiar scene. An old question echoed in his mind, now clearer than ever. Should I get up and leave as I've done so many times before, or this time, should I stay? Daniel knew that whatever he chose, this moment wouldn't be wasted. He took a deep breath. Then he lifted his head. "Please tell me," he said slowly, "who decided that I don't belong here?" The question fell into the airplane cabin like a small stone, not loudly, but enough to create a ripple. The white woman pursed her lips. The flight attendant remained silent for a long, drawn-out moment. And somewhere very deep inside Daniel something began to shift. Not anger, not hatred. It's about being alert. He understood that this story had only just begun. No one said another word for the next few seconds. The airplane cabin fell into a profound silence. Not the pleasant tranquility before takeoff, but a tense silence where everyone sensed something was wrong but no one wanted to be the first to address it. Daniel Carter remained seated, back straight, hands resting lightly on his lap. His gaze never left the chief flight attendant, Linda Harper, who stood before him with a smile that had begun to stiffen. Linda had been doing this job for over 20 years. She had dealt with all kinds of difficult passengers, witnessed noisy arguments, drunken rages, and irrational outbursts of anger. But this situation was different. The man in front of her didn't raise his voice. He didn't seem aggressive. He didn't exert any pressure. It was precisely that calmness that made her uncomfortable. She glanced quickly at the woman standing in the aisle, Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn wore a finely tailored, pale beige wool coat. Her blonde hair was neatly combed, not a single stray strand out of place. On her wrist was a thin metal watch which Linda immediately recognized as not inexpensive. Everything about Evelyn spoke of one thing: "I'm used to being treated like a princess." Evelyn raised her eyebrows when she saw that Daniel still hadn't gotten up. "What's wrong?" she asked again, her voice a little louder this time. "We're going to be late." Linda cleared her throat. "Ma'am, we're dealing with it." Evelyn didn't take her eyes off Daniel. She looked him up and down, without concealment, without embarrassment. A cold, quick glance, like someone glancing at an unsatisfactory item in a shop. Daniel recognized that look. He'd seen it in many other places. In hotel elevators, in boardrooms, in upscale restaurants where waiters asked him if he had a reservation while everyone else hadn't. He wasn't angry, but he remembered it. "Are you sure you're not sitting in the wrong seat?" Evelyn said, this time directly to Daniel. She gave a slight smile. "This seat is usually reserved for regular guests." Daniel looked up at her. "Yes," he replied, his voice low and clear. "I'm a regular customer too." Evelyn chuckled softly, a short, devoid of any joy. "Really?" She turned to Linda. "Could you double-check for me? I've reserved a window seat." Linda felt her heart race. She knew she could get tested. She also knew what the results would be. But Evelyn's gaze, along with the silence of the other passengers, created an invisible pressure. She turned and whispered, "Mark." Mark Reynolds, the gate supervisor, was standing nearby, checking his watch. He was responsible for ensuring the flight departed on time. Seeing Linda call his name, he walked over, looking slightly tense. "What's going on?" Mark asked. Linda lowered her voice. "There's a passenger in seat 1A, Mrs. Whitmore says that seat is hers." Mark looked at Daniel, then at Evelyn, then back at Daniel. He'd encountered similar situations before, but usually the person asked to switch seats would immediately stand up and apologize profusely. This time, however, it wasn't. Mark cleared his throat. "Sir," he said to Daniel, trying to keep his tone neutral, "we need to double-check your seat information." Daniel nodded. "Of course." He handed the boarding pass to Mark. Mark took it and glanced at it quickly. Seat 1A. Name Daniel Carter. No errors. No mistakes. Mark returned the card, hesitating slightly. Your information is correct. Evelyn crossed her arms. So why am I seated in the middle? She asked, her voice sharp. I've been flying this airline for decades. I've never sat in the middle seat in this cabin before. Mark felt sweat begin to trickle down the back of his neck. He hated situations like this. No one was clearly in the wrong. But someone was unhappy, and experience told him that the unhappy person was usually the one who caused the most trouble. It could be the system, he said. We could, no, Evelyn interrupted. Not the system. I want that seat. She pointed at Daniel very quickly. The gesture wasn't rude, but it was clear, as if Daniel were an object that could be moved. Daniel looked at the hand. Then he looked up at Evelyn's face. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. Not because of this particular incident, but because he had been in similar situations far too many times, always having to explain, always having to prove himself, always having to remain calm, so as not to be labeled annoying. In his head, his father's voice echoed deep and slow. You don't need to shout to be respected, but you don't need to disappear either. Daniel turned to Mark. Can you tell me? He asked. Is there any technical reason why I need to change seats? Mark shook his head. No. Well then, Daniel said softly, I think I'll sit here. There was no challenge, no sarcasm, just a very ordinary statement. But for Evelyn, it was the last straw. This is unbelievable, she said louder so that those around her could hear. Do you know who I am? Daniel didn't answer the question immediately. He just looked at her, his gaze so calm that Evelyn felt belittled. Probably not, he replied, but I don't think that's relevant. A few passengers whispered softly. Some turned away. Others stared more intently. Linda sensed the situation was spiraling out of control. She took a step forward. Mr. Carter, she said, calling him by his name for the first time, we earnestly request your cooperation to ensure the flight is not delayed. Daniel looked at Linda. He saw something very familiar in her eyes, the hesitation between right and convenient. Can you tell me, he asked, what does cooperation mean here? Linda pursed her lips. That means we switch places. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. He paused for a moment. Then he continued, his voice still even. In that case, I respectfully decline to cooperate. The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. Evelyn's eyes widened. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. Daniel knew what he had just done. He knew this moment could take many different turns. He also knew that from this moment on, every action he took would be scrutinized twice as hard. But deep down he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't because he was sure to win. It was because this time he didn't walk away. And somewhere deep in Linda and Mark's eyes, Daniel realized something. They're starting to evaluate him. Not based on tickets, not based on data, but it's based on their feelings. From this point on, the story is no longer just about a chair. Daniel Carter sensed the change in the atmosphere even before it was spoken aloud. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a command. It was the way those around him began to shift their gaze. A man in the seat across the hall leaned down, pretending to adjust his shoelaces. A young woman looked at her phone longer than necessary. Two people behind Daniel whispered to each other, then fell silent when his gaze inadvertently swept over them. Daniel was used to moments like that. Moments when someone is put in a position of causing trouble even though they haven't done anything wrong. Linda Harper stood before him, her hands clasped together. She took a deep breath as if preparing for a short speech she had rehearsed in her head. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice softer than before, I understand you're upset, but to make things smoother we can arrange a different seat for you in this section. Just not seat 1A. Daniel looked at her. And what's the reason, he asked. Linda hesitated. Once, then twice. To please another passenger, she replied, finally saying it. Daniel nodded. I understand. He paused, letting the silence do its job. Do you frequently ask passengers to change seats just to please someone else? He continued, his voice neither high nor low. Linda felt her cheeks flush. Not always, she said. But in some cases. What kind of situation is that? Daniel asked gently. The question flustered Linda. She couldn't articulate what she was thinking. She couldn't say that this was a case where the person making the request seemed more accustomed to power than the person seated. Mark Reynolds stepped into that space. Sir, Mark said, his voice beginning to show impatience. We're trying to resolve this situation quickly. If you agree to switch seats, we can continue our flight. Daniel turned to Mark. You just said resolve the situation, he said. Can you tell me what the situation is? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. The situation is, there's some dissatisfaction, he said. Whose is it? Daniel asked. Mark didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Evelyn Whitmore, who was standing leaning against the cabin wall, arms crossed, lips pressed together. Evelyn took a step forward. It's mine, she said. And I think that's perfectly clear. Daniel looked at her. Yes, he replied. I think so too. His tone wasn't sarcastic, but it was precisely that calmness that irritated Evelyn even more. I don't understand why this is so complicated, Evelyn said. I'm just asking for something I've always been entitled to. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And I, he said, am just sitting where I paid to sit. Evelyn laughed, this time more distinctly. Really, you don't look like the type of person who usually sits here. The words fell into the airplane cabin, not heavily but sharply. Daniel felt a slight tightening in his chest. It wasn't anger, but a familiar sensation like touching an old scar. What kind of person? He asked. Evelyn shrugged. You know, she said, her voice sounding as if she were talking about the weather. Nothing personal. Daniel smiled very slightly. I understand. But in his mind, old images began to resurface. The first time he stepped into a large conference room in San Francisco, he was in his early 30s. The security guard asked him to show his employee ID while everyone else did not. Once he took his mother out to dinner at a fancy restaurant. The waiter suggested they sit near the kitchen. He was standing in front of a luxury apartment to look at buying it, and the real estate agent asked him if he could financially afford it. Each time Daniel chose to remain silent. He worked, he moved forward. He let his success speak for itself. But today on this flight, that silence is no longer enough. Linda took another step forward. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice beginning to harden, if you do not agree to switch seats, we will have to record you as an uncooperative passenger. The word uncooperative was emphasized. Daniel looked her straight in the eyes. Are you sure that's how you want to acknowledge it? He asked. Linda felt her heart pound. She didn't like the way this man looked at her. Not because the gaze was threatening, but because it made her feel scrutinized. Mark interjected, Sir, we don't want to make things difficult. Daniel nodded. Me too. He paused. Then he continued. But I want to ask you a question, Mark, Daniel said, his voice slightly lower. If the person sitting in this chair looked more like Mrs. Whitmore, would you ask them to change seats? Mark froze. That question isn't accusatory, but it reveals something. Some passengers began to pay closer attention. Some raised their eyebrows. Some furrowed their brows. No one said anything, but the atmosphere had changed. Evelyn blushed. What are you implying? She asked. Daniel turned to her. Nothing, he replied. I'm just trying to understand the logic of this situation. Linda felt control slipping from her grasp. She was used to passengers obeying her. Change seats, apologize, and that was it. But this man didn't do that. Sir, she said, her voice no longer soft, this time this is my final request. Please stand. Daniel looked around the airplane cabin. He saw the faces avoiding his gaze. He saw the spacious, expensive seats where everyone was sitting quietly, hoping this would soon be over. He was faced with a very clear choice. He could stand up, walk to the back, Sit down somewhere else, and everyone would breathe a sigh of relief. Evelyn would be pleased. Linda and Mark would get back to their work. The flight would take off. Or he could stay and let things go further. Daniel looked down at his hands, long fingers that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, fingers that had shaken hands with the most powerful people in the industry. He thought of his mother, the woman who had taught him how to remain calm when insulted. He thought of his father, who always said that sometimes silence is wise, but sometimes silence is complicity. Daniel looked up. "No," he said, his voice clear enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "I'm not getting up." Linda felt the blood rush to her ears. "Sir," unless Daniel continued interrupting, "there's a safety or technical reason that forces me to do so." No one answered. Inside the airplane cabin, a truth began to emerge, though no one had yet named it. This is no longer about seating arrangements. This is a test of power. And Daniel knew that, from this moment on, the price of staying could be very high. But deep down he also knew something else. If he stands up now, he will carry that feeling with him for a long time. And this time, he chose to stay. There is a kind of power that doesn't come from title, doesn't come from ability, and doesn't come from facts. It stems from borrowing someone else's name, and from the belief that the world will automatically make way for them. Daniel Carter realized that moment when Evelyn Whitmore stopped talking to him. She turned completely to Mark Reynolds and Linda Harper, as if Daniel had become an invisible obstacle, an impediment that needed to be removed, no further discussion needed. "All right," Evelyn said, her voice low but cold. "I don't have time for this." She opened her handbag and took out her phone. No rush, no hurry. The gesture of someone who was all too familiar with others having to wait for her. "I'll call Thomas Blake," she said, her eyes still glued to the screen. "We know each other." That name made Mark flinch slightly. Thomas Blake, CEO of this airline. Linda heard it too. Her heart sank. Not because she was afraid of Daniel, but because the name that had just been released sounded so casual, like a trump card. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mark said quickly. "Please wait a moment." "We know," Evelyn interrupted. "I've waited long enough." Daniel sat there watching. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this many times before, only usually he was on the other side, the side of the person whose name was being used as a weapon. Evelyn held the phone to her ear. "Thomas, it's me." "Evelyn." No one could hear what was being said on the other end of the line. But Evelyn's voice had changed noticeably. Softer, more intimate, as if she had just stepped into a different room. "Yes, I'm on a flight to London. No, it hasn't taken off yet. There's a small problem." She glanced at Daniel, then turned away. "Someone is sitting in my VIP seat and won't cooperate." Daniel closed his eyes slightly for a second, not because of the pain, but because of the saddening familiarity of that story. He heard Linda swallow hard. Mark stood still, his hands clasped behind his back. Evelyn continued, her voice firm. "Yes, I understand, but I think this could be resolved more quickly if you knew." She ended the call, then turned to Mark with a very faint smile. "Thomas will call you back," she said. "I believe everything will be all right." The air in the compartment became heavier. Mark felt a palpable pressure on his shoulders. He didn't know how well Evelyn actually knew Thomas Blake, but he also didn't have the courage to bet that she was lying. He turned to Linda. Their eyes met for a very brief moment. A moment of silent complicity. "Perhaps," Mark said, his voice slowing, "we should find a more flexible solution." Daniel heard the word flexible, and he knew exactly what it meant. "What were you going to say?" Daniel asked. Mark looked at him. This time his gaze was no longer neutral. There was something akin to a warning in it. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, "sometimes to keep things running smoothly we need to make some concessions." Daniel nodded. "I agree." He paused. "But I want to make sure I understand correctly," he said. "Are you asking me to compromise because I'm wrong, or because someone else is unhappy?" Mark remained silent. Evelyn sighed. "You really don't understand," she said. "There are people who are used to being treated like special treatment. And there are people who aren't. The words weren't loud, they weren't harsh, but they were sharp. A few passengers heard it. A middle-aged man frowned. An elderly woman shook her head slightly, but no one said anything. Daniel felt a small wave rise in his chest. Not anger, rather something akin to sadness. He looked at Evelyn. "Do you believe that?" he asked. Evelyn shrugged. "That's the reality." Daniel turned to Linda. "You think so too?" Linda avoided his gaze. "Sir," she said, "I'm just doing my job." Daniel smiled very slightly. "I understand," he said. "Me too." Mark received a call. The phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. He took it out and glanced quickly at the screen. An internal number. He took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, sir," Mark said. "We're handling it." He listened for a while, nodding repeatedly. "Yes, I understand." When he hung up, his expression had changed. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, his voice now firmer, "we need you to leave this seat. No more asking permission, no more seeking cooperation." Daniel looked directly at Mark. "Is that a request or an order?" he asked. "That's the instruction," Mark replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "Well then," he said, "I want to make this clear. I am being asked to leave my assigned seat not for safety or technical reasons, but because of another passenger's dissatisfaction. Is that correct?" Mark clenched his jaw. "You're making things harder than necessary." Daniel tilted his head. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps I'm just asking you to do it right." Evelyn gave a wry smile. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked. "Fighting for justice." Daniel looked at her. "No," he replied. "I'm just sitting." A very brief moment passed. Then Linda stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice no longer gentle, "if you continue to refuse, we will be forced to classify you as a non-compliant passenger." That was stated clearly. Non-compliance. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew where that could lead. He'd seen the video, he'd read the news. He knew a black man labeled non-compliant in a confined space could quickly become a threat in the eyes of others. He looked around the airplane cabin. The eyes. People were starting to pick up their phones, pretending to check messages. Daniel placed both hands on the armrests of the chair. He wasn't trembling, but he felt very clearly the boundary he had just crossed. "Before you do that," he said, his voice low and slow, "I want to ask one last question." Linda looked at him warily. "What do you want to ask?" Daniel looked directly at her. "If I leave this seat now," he asked, "will any of you remember that I did nothing wrong?" No one answered. Evelyn turned away her face, showing impatience. Mark looked down at the floor. Linda swallowed. Daniel nodded as if he had anticipated it. Then he said very softly, "We understand." He hasn't stood up, not yet. But he also knew that from this moment on the story had gone far beyond a mere chair. The power has been borrowed, and it is about to be used. There is a kind of power that doesn't come from title, doesn't come from ability, and doesn't come from facts. It stems from borrowing someone else's name and from the belief that the world will automatically make way for them. Daniel Carter realized that moment when Evelyn Whitmore stopped talking to him. She turned completely to Mark Reynolds and Linda Harper, as if Daniel had become an invisible obstacle. An impediment that needed to be removed, no further discussion needed. "All right," Evelyn said, her voice low but cold. "I don't have time for this." She opened her handbag and took out her phone. No rush, no hurry. The gesture of someone who was all too familiar with others having to wait for her. "I'll call Thomas Blake," she said, her eyes still glued to the screen. "We know each other." That name made Mark flinch slightly. Thomas Blake, CEO of this airline. Linda heard it too. Her heart sank. Not because she was afraid of Daniel, but because the name that had just been released sounded so casual, like a trump card. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mark said quickly, "please wait a moment." No," Evelyn interrupted. "I've waited long enough." Daniel sat there watching. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this many times before, only usually he was on the other side, the side of the person whose name was being used as a weapon. Evelyn held the phone to her ear. "Thomas, it's me, Evelyn." No one could hear what was being said on the other end of the line, but Evelyn's voice had changed noticeably, softer, more intimate, as if she had just stepped into a different room. "Yes, I'm on a flight to London. No, it hasn't taken off yet. There's a small problem." She glanced at Daniel, then turned away. "Someone is sitting in my VIP seat and won't cooperate." Daniel closed his eyes slightly for a second, not because of the pain, but because of the saddening familiarity of that story. He heard Linda swallow hard. Mark stood still, his hands clasped behind his back. Evelyn continued, her voice firm. "Yes, I understand, but I think this could be resolved more quickly if you knew." She ended the call, then turned to Mark with a very faint smile. "Thomas will call you back," she said. "I believe everything will be all right." The air in the compartment became heavier. Mark felt a palpable pressure on his shoulders. He didn't know how well Evelyn actually knew Thomas Blake, but he also didn't have the courage to bet that she was lying. He turned to Linda. Their eyes met for a very brief moment. A moment of silent complicity. "Perhaps," Mark said, his voice slowing, "we should find a more flexible solution." Daniel heard the word flexible and he knew exactly what it meant. "What were you going to say?" Daniel asked. Mark looked at him. This time his gaze was no longer neutral. There was something akin to a warning in it. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, "sometimes to keep things running smoothly, we need to make some concessions." Daniel nodded. "I agree." He paused. "But I want to make sure I understand correctly," he said. "Are you asking me to compromise because I'm wrong, or because someone else is unhappy?" Mark remained silent. Evelyn sighed. "You really don't understand," she said. "There are people who are used to being treated like special treatment. And there are people who aren't." The words weren't loud, they weren't harsh, but they were sharp. A few passengers heard it. A middle-aged man frowned. An elderly woman shook her head slightly. But no one said anything. Daniel felt a small wave rise in his chest. Not anger, rather something akin to sadness. He looked at Evelyn. "Do you believe that?" he asked. Evelyn shrugged. "That's the reality." Daniel turned to Linda. "You think so too?" Linda avoided his gaze. "Sir," she said, "I'm just doing my job." Daniel smiled very slightly. "I understand," he said. "Me too." Mark received a call. The phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. He took it out and glanced quickly at the screen. An internal number. He took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, sir," Mark said. "We're handling it." He listened for a while, nodding repeatedly. "Yes, I understand." When he hung up, his expression had changed. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, his voice now firmer, "we need you to leave this seat. No more asking permission. No more seeking cooperation." Daniel looked directly at Mark. "Is that a request or an order?" he asked. "That's the instruction," Mark replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "Well then," he said, "I want to make this clear. I am being asked to leave my assigned seat, not for safety or technical reasons, but because of another passenger's dissatisfaction." "Is that correct?" Mark clenched his jaw. "You're making things harder than necessary." Daniel tilted his head. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps I'm just asking you to do it right." Evelyn gave a wry smile. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked. "Fighting for justice." Daniel looked at her. "No," he replied. "I'm just sitting." A very brief moment passed. Then Linda stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice no longer gentle, "if you continue to refuse, we will be forced to classify you as a non-compliant passenger." That was stated clearly. Non-compliance. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew where that could lead. He'd seen the video. He'd read the news. He knew a black man, labeled non-compliant in a confined space, could quickly become a threat in the eyes of others. He looked around the airplane cabin. The eyes, People were starting to pick up their phones, pretending to check messages. Daniel placed both hands on the armrests of the chair. He wasn't trembling, but he felt very clearly the boundary he had just crossed. "Before you do that," he said, his voice low and slow, "I want to ask one last question." Linda looked at him warily. "What do you want to ask?" Daniel looked directly at her. "If I leave this seat now," he asked, "will any of you remember that I did nothing wrong?" No one answered. Evelyn turned away, her face showing impatience. Mark looked down at the floor. Linda swallowed. Daniel nodded as if he had anticipated it. Then he said very softly, "We understand. He hasn't stood up, not yet." But he also knew that from this moment on the story had gone far beyond a mere chair. The power has been borrowed, and it is about to be used. Two security guards stopped about 3 steps away from Daniel Carter. They said nothing immediately. They just stood there, broad-shouldered, sturdy, their eyes quickly scanning the entire VIP cabin. Their arrival was quiet, but enough to let everyone know that the situation had officially escalated. Daniel looked at them, then at Linda Harper. "She called security," he said, not as a question. Linda nodded. "Yes," she replied, "because he refused to cooperate." That's where it came from again, lack of cooperation. Daniel turned to Mark Reynolds. "Do you agree with that description?" he asked. Mark avoided his gaze for a very brief moment. "We're just following procedure," he said. Daniel smiled very slightly. Not a sarcastic smile, but the smile of someone who had heard that phrase too many times. The process he repeated. One of the two security officers stepped forward. "Sir," he said in a flat tone, "we have been informed that you are causing a disturbance and not following crew instructions." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't because of the words themselves. It was because of the way it was packaged. Disrupting order. Disobeying orders. These words, when applied to a black man in a confined space, can open up many terrible scenarios. Daniel took a deep breath. He kept his voice slow and clear. "I want to make it clear," he said, looking directly at the security officer. "I was sitting in the seat assigned to me on my ticket. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't threatening anyone. I only refused to change seats because another passenger was unhappy." The security guard nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "We're not here to argue about right and wrong," he said. "We're here to ensure safety and order." Daniel understood what that sentence meant. Safety and order don't always side with truth. They side with tranquility. Evelyn Whitmore stood behind them, arms crossed, her face relaxed. She said nothing, but there was a clear sense of relief in her posture, as if everything had finally gone in the right direction. Linda felt her heart pounding. She looked at Daniel, then at the two security guards, then at her watch. Part of her wanted this to end quickly. Another part was starting to feel uneasy. "Mr. Carter," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "please stand up and follow them." Daniel didn't get up right away. He placed both hands on the armrests of the chair, feeling the cool leather under his fingertips. It was a small detail, but it helped him maintain his focus. "Before I do that," he said, "I need to ask a question." The security guard frowned slightly. "Just ask your questions quickly." Daniel looked directly at Linda. "Are you recording me as a non-compliant passenger?" he asked. Linda felt her throat dry up. "Yes," she replied after a brief pause. "That's how we have to record it." Daniel nodded. "Can you tell me," he said, "what specific actions of mine would be considered non-compliance?" Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. She couldn't say, because he was sitting in the wrong seat, because he wasn't. She couldn't say because he was causing trouble, because he wasn't. Nor could she say because he threatened, because he never did. "He refused to follow the crew's instructions," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "I'm refusing a request that has no safety or technical basis," he said. "That's the difference." The security officer stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice now firmer, "if you continue to argue, we will be forced to escort you off the plane." The word escort was clearly audible. Daniel looked around the airplane cabin. Eyes, silent faces. A few phones were hidden behind bags, but the cameras were still pointed at him. He realized one thing very clearly: everything was being recorded. Not just by cameras but by the memories of those who witnessed it. He thought of his son, 16 years old, almost as tall as him. He had begun to ask difficult questions about the world, about justice, about how people saw him. He thought about the boy watching videos like this somewhere online and wondered, if it were me, what should I do? Daniel took a deep breath. "Okay," he said. "I'll stand up." Linda breathed a sigh of relief. Mark relaxed his shoulders slightly. Evelyn turned away as if the matter were settled. Daniel stood up, slowly, without haste, without anger, but he continued, now standing upright. "I want to add one more thing." The security guard looked at him warily. "What do you want to say?" Daniel looked him straight in the eye. "I'll go with you," he said, "but I don't admit that I did anything wrong." The airplane cabin was eerily silent. The security guard nodded as if he had heard this before. "You have the right to your opinion." Daniel turned to Linda. "Did you hear me?" he asked. Linda nodded but didn't dare look him in the eye. "I'm listening." Daniel turned to Mark. "You too?" Mark swallowed. "Yes." Daniel looked at Evelyn one last time. She avoided his gaze. "You know," Daniel said, his voice low but clear enough, "there are words that once attached to a person will stay with them for a very long time." Evelyn didn't answer. Daniel turned back to the two security guards. "Let's go," he said. He walked out into the hallway. Each step was firm. No one touched him, but the presence of the two security guards on either side was enough to send a very clear message. As Daniel walked past the compartment, he heard a very faint whisper coming from somewhere behind him. He didn't do anything. Daniel didn't turn around, but he heard. As he stepped out of the plane, the cool air from the sunroof rushed in. It felt very different, more spacious, but also more empty. He paused for a second, turning his head to look inside the compartment. Linda stood there. Mark stood there. Evelyn stood there. 3 people, 3 choices, 3 paths. Daniel knew that from this moment on, none of them could pretend that this had never happened. And he also knows one more thing. Being labeled non-compliant is not the end of the story. This is just the beginning. Daniel Carter stepped through the airplane door. There was no pushing or shoving. No hands touched him. But the presence of 2 security guards on either side was enough to turn this moment into a symbolic departure. Not everyone gets asked to disembark from a plane in that manner. And Daniel knew very well what that meant in the eyes of those watching. The bridge was long and narrow. Pale white fluorescent lights shone directly down onto the metal floor. Footsteps echoed more clearly than usual, as if the space were amplifying every movement. Daniel walked slowly, not because he was asked to, but because he wanted to keep his breathing steady. He could feel each heartbeat very clearly, not frantic, not panicked, just a steady beat, trying to keep his mind clear. Behind him, the VIP compartment was strangely silent. Those who had just been sipping wine, adjusting their seats, and checking emails are now witnessing a man being escorted off the plane for non-compliance. Daniel didn't turn around. But he knew they were watching. He also knew that some of them were filming. Some were wondering if this was going too far, and some were relieved that at least it wasn't them. As they approached the end of the glass bridge, another airport employee was waiting. He looked at Daniel, then at the 2 security officers. "What's wrong?" the man asked in a low voice. "One passenger is not complying with regulations," one of the 2 security officers replied. Daniel heard it. He didn't react. The word is repeated again, like a sticker, as a way of simplifying things. They stopped in the area right in front of the boarding gate. The space was more open. There were announcements over the loudspeaker in the distance, the sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the floor, scattered voices. Daniel stood there amidst the crowd, yet completely detached. "Sir," one of the security guards said, his voice less harsh than before, "we need you to wait here." Daniel nodded. "I understand." They stood at a comfortable distance from him, not too close to put pressure on him, but not too far to make him feel too free. Daniel looked around. JFK Airport in the early morning always had a very unique rhythm. Business, travelers, tourists, hurried people, tired people. Each person carried their own story. And now his story is being abruptly cut short. He felt a heavy weight rising in his chest. Not anger, but a shame that was difficult to name. It wasn't because he had done anything wrong. It was because he knew that from a distance, no one would know. From a distance, they only saw a black man being escorted off the plane by security. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He thought of other mornings, the times he stood on stage introduced with flowery words, the firm handshakes, the flashing lights. He thought about the bitter contrast of this moment. A man can be the CEO in one room and become a problem in another space. An airport employee approached, carrying a walkie-talkie. "We're awaiting further instructions," he told the two security personnel. "The flight is being held." Daniel heard that. He didn't know why the flight was delayed, but he guessed most likely it was because of him. He looked down at his shoes, a small scratch on the toe that he hadn't had time to polish. A very real detail, very real. A silent struggle was taking place in his mind. Should I say anything more? Should I ask to speak to a higher-level manager? He knew he could. He knew he had the right. But he also knew that any further words at this moment could be interpreted in a detrimental way. Daniel learned that from a very young age. When he was a young student, he was pulled over in an affluent neighborhood simply for looking inappropriate. His father then taught him, you can't win by arguing with the person in control. But after a long silence, his father added something else. You win by memorizing. Daniel opened his eyes. He realized that what he was feeling wasn't just personal shame, it was a collective wound. Something many people had experienced, only not everyone had the chance to be heard afterward. A middle-aged woman pulled a suitcase past, glanced at him, then turned to whisper something to her companion. Daniel couldn't hear clearly, but he guessed what she said. A young couple stopped a few steps away, pretending to look at the information board, but their eyes kept glancing in his direction. Daniel stood still. He didn't bow his head, but he didn't raise his chin either. He adopted a very familiar posture. The posture of someone who is all too familiar with enduring in silence. One of the two security guards turned to him. "Sir," he said in a lower voice, "do you need any water?" Daniel looked at him slightly surprised. "No, thank you," he replied. "I'm fine." The security guard nodded, then turned away, a small gesture. But Daniel noticed it. Not everyone in this story is heartless, but the system is. Daniel thought of Linda Harper, the moment she made the decision to call security. He didn't believe she was a bad person. He believed she was someone who was used to choosing the least risky path for herself. He thought of Mark Reynolds, a man who knew what was right but chose what was convenient. And he thought of Evelyn Whitmore, the woman who had become accustomed to using other people's names as a master key and never had to face the direct consequences. Daniel exhaled slowly. "It's all right," he told himself. "Not yet." Somewhere in the back in the airplane cabin, Evelyn was sitting in seat 1A, the seat she believed she deserved. She would order a drink, she would adjust her seat, and she would think that everything was settled. Daniel knew that. And he also knew that some stories don't end where people expect them to. A phone rang in his jacket pocket. Daniel felt in his pocket, recognizing the familiar shape of his phone. He didn't rush to take it out. He glanced at the two security guards, then looked around. The vibrations started again. This time, they lasted longer. Daniel knew who was calling, and he knew that call would change the course of everything. He took a deep breath. Then, he slowly pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. The name is clearly visible. Thomas Blake. Daniel stared at the name for a few seconds before deciding whether to answer the call. The telescopes were still lit up. The airport was still noisy. But with Daniel Carter, the world seemed to slow down a beat. The phone vibrated once more in Daniel Carter's hand. It wasn't the frantic vibration of an emergency call. Instead, it was a steady, patient vibration. As if the person on the other end knew for sure that he would answer sooner or later, Daniel looked at the name on the screen, Thomas Blake. He wasn't in a hurry to pick up the phone. Two security officers stood a few steps away from him, pretending to exchange something on their walkie-talkies. They didn't ask any questions. Perhaps they thought it was just a passenger calling a relative to complain. Perhaps they were all too familiar with such calls. Daniel took a deep breath. Not to calm himself, he was calm enough, but to prepare for the weight of the truth that was about to be revealed, he put the phone to his ear. "Hello," Daniel said, his voice low and even. Daniel Thomas Blake's voice came from the other end of the line. Not too loud, not too soft, but there was a clear tension in it. "Where are you?" Daniel looked around the waiting area. People passing by, curious glances, two security guards standing nearby. "I'm standing at the camera bridge," he replied. "I'm no longer on the plane." There was a brief silence. Then Thomas said more slowly, "What do you mean, no longer on the plane?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to start with accusations. He wanted Thomas to ask himself, to piece together the information himself. "They asked me to leave my seat," Daniel said, "and then to leave the plane." Thomas breathed heavily into the phone. "Daniel, what happened?" Daniel looked down at the floor. A small scratch on the metal. An insignificant detail, but it helped him keep his voice steady. "I was sitting in my assigned seat," he said. "Another passenger wanted that seat. The crew asked me to switch seats. I refused. And they called security." The silence on the other end of the line lasted longer than before. Daniel heard Thomas take a deep breath. "You're saying they put you off the plane?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "On the grounds of non-compliance." He spoke those two words very softly, but Thomas could clearly hear the weight in them. "Wait," Thomas said, his voice slightly louder. "You're Daniel Carter. Your ticket." "I know," Daniel said, interrupting, but not sharply. "And they know too." Thomas was silent for a few seconds. Daniel could picture Thomas standing somewhere, perhaps in a private waiting room, phone pressed to his ear, trying to make out what had just happened. "Daniel," Thomas said, his voice different this time. No longer the voice of a CEO speaking to a passenger, rather the voice of someone who had realized a grave mistake. "Who did this?" Daniel didn't rush to answer. "Does that matter?" he asked. "Yes," Thomas replied immediately. "It's very important." Daniel glanced at the two security guards. One of them was looking at him with a curious expression. Daniel turned his back slightly to keep the conversation more private. "The chief flight attendant is Linda Harper," he said. "The gate supervisor is Mark Reynolds." Thomas let out a long sigh. "And what about the other passenger?" Daniel closed his eyes for a second. "Evelyn Whitmore." Another name, another piece of the puzzle. Thomas was silent. This time the silence wasn't due to confusion. It was because he was piecing things together. "Daniel," Thomas said slowly, "do you know who Evelyn Whitmore is?" Daniel smiled very slightly, though Thomas couldn't see it. "I guess," he said, "she thinks she's very important." Thomas chuckled softly, but there was no hint of amusement in his laughter. "She knows a few people on the board," he said. "Not close friends, but enough to make some people worried." Daniel nodded, though Thomas couldn't see. "That explains quite a bit." "Daniel," Thomas said, his voice now serious, "I'm so sorry. This shouldn't have happened." Daniel opened his eyes. He looked into the distance where other planes were taxiing on the runway. "I know," he said, "but it happened." Another moment of silence. Thomas lowered his voice. "Are you okay?" That question made Daniel pause for a moment. No one had asked him that question since it all began. "I'm fine," he replied. "At least physically." Thomas understood what that meant. "Daniel," he said, "I'll handle this immediately." Daniel didn't answer immediately. "How should we handle it?" he asked. Thomas hesitated for a moment. "I'll ask them to put you back on the plane." "I'll know," Daniel said, his voice sounding slightly more firm for the first time. "I don't want to go back on that plane." Thomas froze. "Daniel, it's not because I can't," Daniel continued. "It's because I shouldn't have to." Thomas was silent. He understood. At least Daniel hoped he understood. "I didn't call you to apologize," Daniel said. "I called because I thought you needed to know what was going on in your system." Thomas sighed. "You're right." Daniel paused for a moment, then continued in a low, slow voice. "There's one more thing you need to know." Thomas listened. "I didn't make a fuss," Daniel said. "I didn't protest. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat in my seat." Thomas clutched the phone tightly. "That makes things worse." Daniel smiled sadly. "Yes." Nearby, one of the two security guards received a call over the radio. He nodded, giving a brief reply. Then he looked towards Daniel, his expression now different. Thomas continued, his voice lower. "Daniel, I'm on my way to JFK." Daniel frowned slightly. "That's not necessary." "Yes," Thomas replied. "Absolutely necessary." Daniel thought for a few seconds. "Okay," he said, "but I want to make one thing clear." Thomas waited. "I don't want a quick fix to make everything look okay," Daniel said. "I want you to face this straight on." Thomas nodded on the other end of the line. "You have something to say to me." Daniel ended the call. He lowered the phone, his hand still gripping it tightly for a few seconds, as if needing to make sure that the conversation had actually happened. Two security guards approached. "Sir," said one of them, his voice more polite than before, "we have just received the information. Please wait a little longer." Daniel nodded. "I'm here." He stood there in the middle of the vast airport, sensing a subtle change in the air around him. No one was in a hurry anymore. No one was urging him on anymore. Not because he spoke with Thomas Blake. Because the truth has begun to emerge. Daniel knew this call was just the first step. The real story is only just beginning to be told. Daniel Carter stood still in the waiting area near the camera bridge. No one told him to sit down. No one told him to move to another spot. This silence was different from the previous ones. It didn't smell of coercion. It smelled of anticipation. Two security guards stood a few steps away from him. Their posture had changed. No longer that of someone preparing to intervene, but that of someone awaiting instructions. One of them occasionally glanced at Daniel, his gaze no longer one of suspicion but of curiosity. Daniel realized that. And he realized something else too. In places like this, identity doesn't speak for itself. It spreads, slowly. But once it spreads, it can't be taken back. Another airport employee approached carrying a tablet. He whispered something to the security guard. The security guard nodded, then turned to look at Daniel again for a longer time. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice different now. "Could you please confirm your full name for me?" Daniel looked at him, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Daniel Carter," he replied. "Is there a problem?" The security guard shook his head. "No, sir. It's just, we need to cross-check some more information." Daniel nodded. "I understand." He didn't ask any further questions. He was used to people needing to compare information when the story was no longer as simple as it initially seemed. In the distance near the service counter, Mark Reynolds was standing with a group of other employees. His face was more tense than before. The phone was pressed to his ear. He spoke softly, but his other hand kept rubbing his forehead as if trying to alleviate a sudden headache. Linda Harper stood not far away. She no longer maintained her usual upright posture. Her shoulders were slightly slumped. Her hands clutched a thin file folder. Her gaze briefly swept over Daniel, then quickly shifted away. Daniel looked at them, not with anger, but with a very strange feeling, the feeling of someone who has seen the moment the gears begin to go out of alignment. A bell rings somewhere in the terminal. Another flight is beginning to board. Life goes on, not waiting for anyone's personal tragedy. Daniel looked at his phone. No new messages. But he knew the call with Thomas Blake had triggered a chain reaction. Somewhere, someone is opening a file. Someone is typing his name into the system. Someone is rereading words they should have believed from the beginning. A young airport employee approached holding a piece of paper. She looked at Daniel, then down at the paper, then back at him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I've been asked to confirm." "Are you Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter & More Systems?" Daniel looked up. He wasn't surprised, but he sensed that moment, the moment when the story officially took a different turn. "Yes," he replied. "I am." The young woman paused for a very brief moment. Then she nodded repeatedly, as if she had just realized she was facing something much bigger than she had anticipated. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I'll get back to you right away." She turned and almost ran away. The two security guards looked at each other. Then they looked at Daniel. One of them cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, "we don't know." Daniel raised his hand slightly. "It's all right," he said. "I understand." But, deep down, another thought resonated clearly within him. They don't know until they know. And the question always is, what if they don't know? Daniel turned to look at Linda Harper. She was standing there paler than usual. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She looked at the screen, then at Daniel. Her gaze was no longer rigid. It was a mixture of anxiety and something akin to fear. Linda answered the phone. "Yes, I understand." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice much softer than before. We will cooperate." She hung up the phone. She stood still for a moment. Then she turned to Mark Reynolds. "Mark," she said, her voice low, "we have a problem." Mark looked at her. "What do you mean?" Linda swallowed hard. He's not an ordinary passenger." Mark frowned. "What do you mean, Daniel Carter?" Linda said. "CEO?" Mark froze. "Carter & More Systems?" he asked. Linda nodded. Mark closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them, looking at Daniel. His gaze was completely different now. It was no longer the look of someone handling a situation, but the look of someone who had just realized they had made a wrong bet. "What have we done?" Mark whispered. Linda didn't answer. Daniel watched them exchange words. He felt no satisfaction, no victory. He only saw a familiar cycle revealing itself. When he was a casually dressed black man, he was the problem. When he was CEO, he was the crisis. Daniel turned away. He didn't want to witness that change in attitude any longer than necessary. A middle-aged man in a dark suit approached him, walking quickly but trying to maintain a calm demeanor. His name tag read Senior Manager of the company. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice cautious, "I am David Langley, Managing Director at JFK. I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused." Daniel looked at him. "Have you just found out who I am?" he asked, not sharply. Langley hesitated for a moment. "Yes," he replied. But Daniel nodded. "Thank you for being honest," Langley stammered. "We're investigating. CEO Thomas Blake is on his way here." Daniel frowned. "I told him it wasn't necessary." Langley forced a smile. "Sir, in situations like this, things need to be handled directly." Daniel understood. When identities are revealed, the way people deal with things changes. "What about the flight?" Daniel asked. Langley swallowed. "The flight is being held up." Daniel looked toward the boarding gate. He pictured Evelyn Whitmore sitting in seat 1A. She might have ordered a drink. She might be scrolling through her phone, convinced everything was settled. He wondered if anyone had told her at that moment that the person being taken off the plane wasn't an uncooperative person, but Daniel Carter. Daniel felt a profound weariness. Not weariness from standing, but weariness from the fact that this truth always needed a title to be respected. He turned to look at Langley. "I don't want a formulaic apology," Daniel said, his voice low. "I want to know how this will be interpreted." Langley nodded. "We're reviewing the entire report." Daniel smiled very slightly. "Good," he said, "because this story isn't just mine." Somewhere in the back, a passenger in the VIP section was recording video through a gap in the door. Messages began to be sent. A name started appearing in private conversations. Daniel Carter. And as that name spread, all eyes shifted. But for Daniel, that led to only one question. If I weren't Daniel Carter today, how would this have ended? He knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. And you know we haven't reached the climax yet. No one ordered space to change. But it did change. Daniel Carter sensed it before he saw anyone, not with his eyes, but with the rhythm of the people around him. The airport staff started walking faster. Gone was the leisurely pace, often seen during long shifts. One person checked their radio constantly. Another opened their laptop right at the counter, typing quickly, pausing, then typing again. No one spoke loudly, but everyone was getting ready. David Langley stood beside Daniel, his expression completely different from when he first arrived. Gone was the polite formality. Instead, it was the tension of someone awaiting an important meeting. "Mr. Carter," Langley said in a low voice, "Thomas Blake just arrived at security. He'll be here for a few minutes." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He didn't ask any further questions. He didn't seem impatient either. Ironically, that attitude only made those around him more tense. In the distance, Mark Reynolds stood near the control panel. His phone vibrated incessantly. Each time he looked at the screen, his face turned a little paler. Linda Harper stood beside him, clutching a file tightly in her hands. She no longer looked directly at Daniel, but she couldn't take her eyes off the spot where he was standing. Questions began to clash in Linda's mind. What did I do? I called security for someone, just because he wouldn't stand up. And the most terrifying question, what if he's not the CEO? Linda didn't dare dwell on that thought any longer. A slight movement at the end of the hallway drew everyone's attention. A group of people emerged from the security checkpoint. In the middle was Thomas Blake. He wasn't particularly tall. He wasn't ostentatious, but the way he walked made people automatically move aside. His dark blue suit fit perfectly. His steps were quick and steady. His gaze was focused, not wandering aimlessly. When Thomas Blake appeared, the atmosphere really changed. David Langley stepped forward. "Thomas," he said, "thank you for arriving so quickly." Thomas nodded without stopping. "Where's Daniel?" he asked. Langley turned and pointed. Thomas Blake saw Daniel Carter. The moment their eyes met, one thing was clear. This wasn't a meeting between a CEO and a client. This was a meeting between two men who had once sat at the same table, argued, and understood how power worked. Thomas walked straight towards Daniel. "Daniel," he said, his voice low and firm, "I'm very sorry." Daniel looked at him. "Can we talk privately?" he asked. Thomas nodded immediately. "Of course." The two stood slightly to one side. No need for a private room, no need to close the door. Privacy at this moment came from the weight of the conversation, not the space. "This," Thomas said directly, without beating around the bush, "is a system failure, and it's a human failure." Daniel didn't argue. "I agree," he said, "but I want to know where the error will be recorded." Thomas looked at him for a long time. "In the right place," he replied. "And with the right person." Daniel nodded. "Good." Behind them, Linda Harper and Mark Reynolds were standing not far away. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they saw everything. "I saw Thomas Blake standing before Daniel. I saw the way he leaned in to listen. I saw the complete lack of defensiveness in his eyes." Mark felt his stomach clench. "Linda," he whispered, "this isn't right." Linda didn't answer. Thomas turned to Langley. "How was the flight?" he asked. Langley swallowed. "He's being held." Thomas nodded. "Good." Then he turned back to look at Daniel. "Would you like to go back on that flight?" Thomas asked. Daniel shook his head without hesitation. "No." Thomas didn't ask why. "Okay," he said. "We'll arrange another trip." Daniel looked at him. "It's not just about the flight." Thomas nodded. "I know." Daniel lowered his voice. "I want you to understand this," he said. "I wasn't treated like that because I was wrong. I was treated like that because I looked like the kind of person they thought could be." Thomas closed his eyes for a very brief second. "Daniel," he said, "you don't need to convince me." Daniel smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I need you to act." Thomas turned around. "Linda Harper," he called, his voice not loud but loud enough to cut through all the surrounding sounds. Linda was startled. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Yes." "Mr. Blake," she said. Thomas looked straight at her. Not angry. But there was no hint of gentleness either. "Were you the chief flight attendant on that flight?" he asked. "Yes," Linda replied. "Did you ask Mr. Carter to switch seats?" Thomas asked further. Linda swallowed. "Yes." "On what basis are you basing that?" Thomas asked. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. "We want to address the dissatisfaction of another passenger." Thomas nodded. "And what about when Mr. Carter refused?" "We called security," Linda said, her voice trailing off. Thomas was silent for a few seconds. Then he turned to Mark Reynolds. "Mark," he said, "can you confirm that?" Mark stepped forward, his face tense. "Yes, sir." Thomas nodded. "That makes sense." He turned to look at Daniel. "Daniel," he said, "I want to say this in front of everyone." The surrounding space seemed to freeze. "What happened today," Thomas said, his voice clear, "is unacceptable, not because of who Carter is, but because he did nothing wrong." Daniel stood still. He didn't nod. He didn't react. He let the words linger in his mind long enough. Thomas continued. "And I also want to make it clear," he said, his gaze sweeping over Linda Mark. Then pausing, "anyone who thinks that power can be borrowed to push others out of their place doesn't understand how we operate." Evelyn Whitmore wasn't there at the time, but her name seemed to float in the air. Langley stood beside him, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. Thomas turned to Daniel again. "What do you want next?" he asked. Daniel paused for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to make sure what he was about to say was true to his values. "I want things to be recorded exactly as they happened," Daniel said. "No downplaying, no blurring." Thomas nodded. "You have something to tell me." Daniel looked straight at him. "And I want you to ask yourself," he continued, his voice low, "if I weren't Daniel Carter today, would your system have protected me?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. "That silence speaks volumes." "We'll talk more," Thomas said finally. "Very soon." Daniel nodded. Behind them, Linda Harper felt her legs go weak. Mark Reynolds bowed his head. "They understand one thing very clearly. The tables have turned. And from this moment on, every previous decision will have real consequences." There was no shouting, no public humiliation. The real consequences never need to be loud. Daniel Carter stood just far enough from Thomas Blake to hear, but also far enough so that no one could interrupt their conversation. The space around them seemed to automatically recede. It was as if everyone understood that from this moment on, every word carried weight. Thomas Blake turned to David Langley. "David," he said, his voice even but firm, "I need a full report. Every step, every decision." Langley nodded. "Yes, Thomas." Thomas didn't look at Linda Harper right away. He made her wait. And it was that weight that weighed more heavily on Linda than any reprimand. "Linda," Thomas said, finally turning around. "How long have you worked here?" Linda swallowed. 22 years, sir." Thomas nodded. 22 years is enough to understand the process," he said, "and enough to understand the boundaries." Linda bowed her head. "Yes." "Do you realize," Thomas continued, "that your decision today has crossed that line?" Linda was silent. She couldn't say no. "Yes," she said very softly. Thomas didn't raise his voice. "Then I'll be clear," he said. "You are suspended immediately pending an internal investigation." There was no murmur. No one was surprised. Just a heavy silence. Linda felt her legs tremble. 22 years, more than 2 decades of service, and in just a few minutes everything was called into question again. "I understand," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I accept." Daniel looked at her. He saw no pleasure, no satisfaction. He only saw a person facing the consequences of a choice. Thomas turned to Mark Reynolds. "Mark," he said, "you were also involved in this decision." Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "Yes, sir." He confirmed the request to call security, Thomas said. "Not a question." Mark nodded. "Yes." Thomas looked him straight in the eye. "You are suspended today," he said. and I want you to think carefully about why." Mark took a deep breath. "Yes, sir." Daniel noticed Mark's hand trembled slightly as he slipped his phone into his pocket. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Thomas turned to look at Daniel. "Daniel," he said, his voice softening slightly, "I want you to know that these decisions aren't made because of who you are." Daniel nodded. "I understand," he said, "and that's exactly what I need." Thomas sighed. "We'll update the report," he said. "Remove any wording that implies you didn't comply." Daniel looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "but I want you to keep the entire process intact. I don't want the story to be wiped clean." Thomas understood immediately. "You want the truth," he said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Complete." In another corner of the terminal, Evelyn Whitmore was still unaware of what was happening outside. She sat in seat 1, scrolling through her phone and sipping the wine that had been brought to her. To her it was just a slightly delayed flight. Until another flight attendant came over. "Mrs. Whitmore," the flight attendant said cautiously, "we need to speak with you for a moment." Evelyn frowned. "What's wrong? Could you please leave your seat for a moment?" the flight attendant said. "We need to clarify some information." Evelyn gave a wry smile. "Are you kidding me?" The flight attendant shook her head. "No, ma'am." As Evelyn stood up, her familiar confidence began to crack. She looked around. Several passengers were looking at her with different eyes. No longer admiring or neutral, but curious. David Langley was waiting outside. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "we need you to confirm some information regarding the recent incident." "An incident?" Evelyn asked, her voice becoming sharp. "I'm the victim here." Langley looked at her calmly. "We are reviewing the whole situation," he said. "And in the meantime we will not be able to continue serving you on this flight." Evelyn was stunned. 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 "What? Your ticket will be refunded," Langley continued, "and we'll contact you later." Evelyn felt her cheeks flush. "Do you know who I am?" she said. Langley nodded. "We know," he replied, "and that's precisely why we need everything handled transparently." Evelyn turned, searching for a familiar gaze, a face that would stand by her side, but there was no one. Borrowed power becomes ineffective when the spotlight shines directly on it. Meanwhile, Daniel stood with Thomas Blake, watching everything unfold as an irreversible chain of consequences. "Daniel," Thomas said, his voice low, "I'd like to invite you to my office. We need to talk about more than just a flight." Daniel thought for a moment. "Okay," he said, "but I want you to understand one thing." Thomas waited. "I don't want anyone losing their job just to calm the storm," Daniel said. "I want the system to change." Thomas nodded. "You'll have a say in that." Daniel looked at him. "Not me," he said. "People like me." Thomas was silent. Then he nodded again. "You're right." Daniel looked around the station. Everything was still moving. But one thing was clear to him. The consequence is not punishment. The consequence is the truth being called by its proper name. And sometimes that alone is enough to shake an entire system. But in Daniel's heart, one question remained unanswered. If he wasn't Daniel Carter today, would these consequences have occurred? He knew that question would haunt him for a long time. And that leads directly to what he's about to say next. Daniel Carter sat alone in the small waiting room behind the executive area. Not a VIP room. No champagne. No gleaming leather seats or windows overlooking the runway. It was just a quiet room, dimly lit, with a soft yellow light, a simple wooden table, and 2 chairs facing each other. On the table sat an untouched glass of water. This silence was a stark contrast to the tense moments that had preceded it. There were no scrutinizing glances, no walkie-talkies, no hurried footsteps. But it was precisely that silence that made a question begin to resonate more clearly than ever before. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. He looked down at his knuckles. These hands had signed hundreds of contracts, seized opportunities many only dreamed of, were greeted with applause. And these same hands just hours earlier were being considered the problem. Not because of their actions, not because of their words, but because of how they appear in that space. The door opened gently. Thomas Blake walked in, no longer impeccably dressed in his suit from the train station. He had taken off his coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up slightly. He looked like someone who had just endured a long and arduous morning. "Daniel Thomas," said his voice lower than before. "Thank you for waiting." Daniel nodded. "I need some quiet time," he said. "And maybe you do too." Thomas smiled slightly. "You read me pretty well." Thomas sat down opposite her. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't put his phone on the table. He put both in his pocket as a subtle signal that this conversation wasn't about crisis management, but about confronting something deeper. Daniel Thomas said, "I want to start by being blunt. If you weren't Daniel Carter today, things might have ended very differently." Daniel looked at him. His eyes showed no surprise. "Do you think differently?" he asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I just don't want to avoid it." Daniel took a deep breath. "Well then," he said, his voice slow and clear, "this is the question I've been thinking about constantly." He paused for a moment. "If I weren't the CEO today," Daniel said, "if I didn't have the name, the connections, the heavy-handed call, how would this have ended?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked out the small window in the corner of the room where he could see a section of the runway in the distance. Another plane was preparing for takeoff. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Daniel Thomas said then, his voice low, "I don't have an answer that will make you happy." Daniel nodded. "I don't need pleasant," he said. "I need honesty." Thomas turned to look at him. "If you weren't Daniel Carter," he said, "perhaps the report would have been recorded differently. Perhaps no one would have asked any questions. Perhaps the flight would have taken off and the story would have ended there." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. Not because of the pain, but because that confirmation had just hit him where it hurt the most. "That's the problem," Daniel said, opening his eyes. "It's not my problem. It's the problem of people who have no other choice." Thomas nodded. "Do you think I don't know that?" he asked. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen things that the reports never mention." Daniel tilted his head. "So why does it still continue?" Thomas sighed. "Because the system was built to run smoothly," he said, "not to question itself." Daniel smiled sadly. "And those crushed by it were just accidents." Thomas remained silent. Daniel continued, his voice, not loud, but each word carried a heavy weight. "I don't want Linda Harper or Mark Reynolds to become scapegoats," he said. "They were wrong. But they weren't the root cause." Thomas nodded. "What do you think the reason is?" Daniel thought for a moment. "They are assumptions," he said. "Silent assumptions about who belongs where, who deserves to be heard, who can be pushed aside without causing trouble." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "when Evelyn Whitmore called me, I thought it was just another unhappy customer." Daniel looked at him. "And what if she doesn't call?" Thomas gave a wry smile. "Well, maybe I didn't know about this." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, but not the heaviness of conflict, rather it was the heaviness of awareness. Daniel Thomas said, "What do you want from me?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at the glass of water in front of him, finally picked it up and took a small sip. "I want you to do something," Daniel said. "And it's not easy." Thomas waited. "I want you to review how your system handles small situations," Daniel said. "Not when they become crises, but when they're small enough to be overlooked." Thomas nodded slowly. "You want to change the process." "It's not just the process," Daniel said. "It's the mindset." Thomas sighed. "Do you know how difficult that is?" Daniel smiled very slightly. "I know," he said. "I've been doing it my whole life." Thomas chuckled softly. "You always say things that make it impossible for anyone to pretend." Daniel leaned forward. "I don't want a PR training session," he said. "I don't want a mass apology email. I want people like me, who don't have to be Daniel Carter to be treated fairly. Thomas stared at him for a long time. You're asking me to confront the darkest corners of this organization, he said. Daniel nodded. Yes. And if I did, Thomas continued, what would you do? Daniel didn't hesitate. I'll stand by you, he said. Not as another CEO, but as someone who once stood on the other side. Thomas was silent for a very long time. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said. We'll start here. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of relief but because he knew this was the hardest part. There's one more thing, Daniel said. Thomas looked at him. I don't want today's story to be buried, Daniel said. Not to shame, but to remind. Thomas frowned. You want it to become known? Daniel shook his head. I want it to be remembered. Thomas nodded slowly. Out there, another flight has just taken off. Everything continues as usual. But for Daniel Carter, the most painful question had been asked. And once it had been asked, no one in this room could pretend they hadn't heard it. That question will follow them. With every decision, with every small situation in the future. And Daniel knew that from this very question, another path was opening up. Agreements aren't always signed on paper. There are agreements formed in prolonged silence, when two people sit opposite each other and understand that if they choose the easier path, they will both return to their familiar lives. But if they choose the harder path, neither of them can pretend as before. Daniel Carter and Thomas Blake were still sitting opposite each other in the small room behind the executive office. No more questions, no more lengthy explanations. Only one decision remains. Thomas Blake was the first to break the silence. Daniel, he said, his voice lower, I've been thinking a lot these past few minutes. Daniel didn't answer. He let Thomas continue. I can do this safely, Thomas said. A press release. A well-written apology. Mandatory training. And then, everything will die down. Daniel nodded. That's the approach most organizations choose. Thomas looked at him. And you know what will happen next. Daniel replied very softly, nothing has changed. Thomas exhaled slowly. Yes. He leaned back in his chair looking directly at Daniel. But you're asking for something else, Thomas said. You're asking me to question the very way this system protects itself. Daniel tilted his head. I'm not suggesting, he said. I'm making a choice. Thomas smiled sadly. You know, he said, I've met a lot of great CEOs. Very few dare to put themselves in a position where they're no longer comfortable. Daniel looked at him. Because they're afraid of losing control. Thomas nodded. And because they're afraid of losing a partner. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice very calm. Then let me help you make your choice easier. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. Carter and Moore Systems, he said, is currently preparing to sign a contract to analyze passenger data with your airline. It's a significant deal. Thomas nodded. I know. Daniel continued. We can sign. Everything will go smoothly. And today's story will be remembered as a handled incident. Thomas looked at him, his gaze sharper. And the other option, Daniel didn't shy away. We're going to pause, he said. Not to put pressure on them, but to create some space. Thomas leaned back. Space for what? For change, Daniel replied. Not on paper, but in how it works. Thomas remained silent. Outside, a luggage cart rolled by, creating a soft metallic clang. It was a very ordinary sound, very commonplace. But in this room it felt like a punctuation mark between two paths. You're putting me in a very difficult position, Thomas said. Daniel nodded. I know. And you know, Thomas continued, that suspending this contract will raise questions from the board. Daniel smiled very slightly. That's what I wanted. Thomas frowned. You want to be questioned? I hope they get questioned, Daniel corrected. About things they've never had to face before. Thomas chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because he realized he was standing before someone who couldn't be intimidated by ordinary threats. You know, Thomas said, most partners will use this as leverage in negotiations. Daniel shook his head. I'm not bargaining, he said. I'm drawing a line. Thomas stared at Daniel for a long time. So what are your boundaries? He asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. First, he said, the entire process for handling uncooperative passengers must be reviewed, with the involvement of an independent party. Thomas nodded. Secondly, Daniel continued, situations like today must be fully documented even if the people involved are not well known. Thomas memorized it. And third, Daniel said, his voice slowing, I want an advisory committee not for show but to provide constructive criticism. Thomas sighed. You're asking me to open the door from the inside. Daniel looked at him. Yes. Thomas closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. If I agree, he said, will you sign the contract again? Daniel thought for a moment. When I saw the first steps, they were real, he said. Yes? Thomas gave a wry smile. The council won't like this. Daniel smiled. I don't like being escorted off the plane either. Thomas genuinely laughed for the first time in this conversation. You really are unforgiving. Daniel tilted his head. No, he said. I just have no patience left with these invisible compromises. Thomas leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a while. Daniel, he said, do you know why this bothers me so much? Daniel waited. Because I know Thomas said if it wasn't you, I might not be sitting here. Daniel nodded. That's precisely why I don't want this story to end with me. Thomas stood up, walked a few steps around the room, then turned back. Okay, he said, we'll do it the hard way. Daniel stood up as well. The two men stood facing each other. There was no immediate handshake. Daniel, Thomas said, I can't promise that things will change quickly. Daniel nodded. I don't need it fast, he said. I need it really fast. Thomas held out his hand. Daniel looked at the hand for a very brief moment. Then he took it. The handshake wasn't strong. It didn't last long, but it was firm enough. We have an agreement, Thomas said. Daniel replied, we have a responsibility. When they let go of each other's hands, Daniel felt something very clearly. This agreement did not bring him a personal victory, nor did it bring him revenge. It opens up a path from which there is no easy return. Outside, David Langley was waiting. Seeing the two of them come out together, he understood that something important had just been decided. We'll continue from here, Thomas said to Langley. And we won't turn back. Langley nodded, though he didn't fully understand the meaning of the sentence. Daniel stepped out into the hallway where the airport lights shone down steadily. Everything seemed normal, but to him a subtle shift had just occurred. It's not in the airline's system. It's in how he chooses to use his power. And he knew this agreement wouldn't just affect the two people in that room. It will reach those who have no voice. But the story isn't over yet. Because there is someone else somewhere else who is also facing the consequences in their own way. Evelyn Whitmore sat alone in the annex waiting area, which had no windows overlooking the runway. This room isn't for VIPs. It's just an intermediate space where people sit waiting for further processing. The white light shines directly down from the ceiling, neither soft nor warm. There's no background music, no welcoming greetings. There's only waiting. Evelyn placed her handbag on the chair beside her, took off her watch and neatly laid it on the table, an old habit whenever she needed to control her emotions. But this time, that habit didn't help much. She looked at her phone screen. No new messages, no calls from the familiar names she had been expecting. They must be busy, she told herself. Or maybe they don't know yet. She took a deep breath. Then she exhaled. The flight should have already taken off. By now she should be adjusting her seat, sipping a glass of wine and flipping through unimportant emails. Instead, she's sitting here in a room she never thought she'd be in. It's just a misunderstanding, Evelyn whispered to herself. Everything will be all right. But the more it was repeated, the more it sounded like a prayer than an assurance. The door opened. David Langley walked in. No files, no tablet, just a thin sheet of paper in his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice polite but distant, we need to confirm a few things. Evelyn looked up. I already said, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'm the one being bothered in this whole thing. Langley nodded. We've taken your point of view into account, he said. But there are some details that need clarification. Evelyn crossed her arms. Clarify what? Langley looked directly at her. Your role in the incident on the flight. Evelyn chuckled briefly. My role? She asked. I'm just asking for the seat I think I deserve. Langley didn't react to the laughter. Did you call CEO Thomas Blake? He asked. Evelyn paused for a moment. Yes, she said. And that's not against the rules. Langley nodded. Not wrong, he said. But we need to confirm the content of the call. Evelyn frowned. What are you implying? Langley placed the paper on the table. We have noted that you described another passenger as uncooperative. Evelyn opened her mouth to retort but then stopped. He refused to switch places, she said. Isn't that uncooperative? Langley was silent for a few seconds. He was sitting in his proper seat, he said. And he didn't violate any rules. Evelyn felt her throat dry up. So what? She said. He could be more flexible. Langley looked at her, his gaze neither judgmental nor disapproving. Do you think he asked that your request would have been granted if the passenger had looked more like you? That question left Evelyn speechless. That's an unfair question, she said quickly. You're turning this into, we're trying to understand the motives, Langley interrupted, his voice still even, not to condemn. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. She felt a wave of weariness wash over her. Not physical weariness, but the weariness of someone being asked a question they couldn't avoid for the first time. I didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice lower. I just did what I always do. Langley nodded slowly. Perhaps, he said, and that's exactly what we're looking at. Evelyn turned away. She looked up at the smooth wall devoid of paintings or clocks, a space that allowed no distractions. So what now? She asked, her voice less sharp now. Langley stood up. You will be fully reimbursed for the cost of the flight, he said, and we will contact you once our internal review is complete. Evelyn looked at him. Is that all? She asked. Langley stopped at the door. For this flight, he said yes. The door closed softly. Evelyn sat alone. No one scolded her. No one accused her. But it was precisely that lack of drama that made her feel even more empty. She opened her phone, called a familiar name. No one answered. She sent a short text message. No immediate response. Evelyn stared at the screen. For the first time in a long time, she felt uncertain about her place in the order she had once believed to be secure. The image of the black man sitting in seat 1 flashed through her mind. A serene face. Eyes that held no pleading, no defiance, just presence. Why doesn't he stand up? She wondered. If only he would stand up, everything would be over. But then another question arose, one that annoyed her even more. Why am I so sure he should stand up? Evelyn shook her head as if trying to dismiss the thought. Don't overreact, she told herself. This will all pass. But deep down she knew something had cracked. Not reputation, not connections. Rather, it is the belief that the world will automatically side with you. Evelyn stood up, grabbed her handbag and walked out of the waiting area, blending into the airport crowd. No one recognized her. No one looked at her any longer than usual. It was a very strange feeling. She always thought of herself as an observer. Now she's just one person in the crowd. As she stepped outside, she paused briefly, looking up at the flight information board. The word delayed was still there, flashing steadily. Evelyn took a deep breath. There are missed flights, and there are things once missed that can never be the same again. Little did she know that elsewhere in the airport, Daniel Carter was also preparing to leave, but in a completely different direction. And little did she know that this story, though no longer mentioning her name much, would still bear the mark of the choices she had made. Quiet, unpretentious, but it's very real. Daniel Carter exited the control room through a side entrance. No one saw me off. No one tried to keep me. Only one airport employee opened the door for him, nodded slightly, and then closed the door behind him. The sound was dry and brief, like a period at the end of a chapter. Outside, the long corridor leading to the pickup area was quieter than other areas. The afternoon light streamed diagonally through the large glass panes, casting long streaks on the stone floor. Daniel walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because he didn't want to rush. His body was used to always moving fast, always moving forward. But today, something made him need to slow down. He stopped in front of a window looking out at the runway. A plane had just taxied, its engines roaring steadily. A familiar sight, a movement he had witnessed hundreds of times in his life. But this time it evoked a different feeling. If only I had been on that flight. If only I had gotten up. Daniel shook his head slightly. He has no regrets. But he doesn't boast either. Right choices rarely bring a feeling of victory. They often bring a sense of weight. The phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. Daniel took it out. A message from Thomas Blake: "Thanks. We'll talk again very soon." Daniel stared at the message for a few seconds. Then he locked the screen. He didn't reply immediately, not because he was indifferent, but because he needed to be alone before moving on. He walked to the taxi stand. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the familiar smell of fuel. A driver asked if he needed a ride. Daniel nodded. As the train rolled along, he leaned his head back against the seat, watching the stream of people passing by outside the window. Each person had a story, a purpose, a direction. After the car had driven a short distance, Daniel closed his eyes. Old images surfaced, not from this morning, but from many years ago. He found himself standing in front of an office building when he was very young, a cheap suit, unpolished shoes. The receptionist looked him up and down, then asked who he was there to see, in a voice he recognized, polite but suspicious. He remembered the meetings where he had to speak slower, clearer, and more accurately than others just to be heard at the same level. He remembered leaving the room wondering if he had spoken too harshly or too gently. Was the silence of the room an agreement, or simply a reluctance to argue with him? Those memories never disappeared. They were simply tucked away in a corner so he could move forward. Today they are being called by their names again. Daniel opened his eyes when the car stopped in front of the hotel. He paid the driver, thanked him, and walked into the lobby. The hotel was quiet. The lighting was soft. The aroma of coffee lingered in the air. The receptionist smiled and greeted him by name. Daniel nodded in return. He went upstairs to his room. It was just the right size. Not overly luxurious, not ostentatious. He put down his bag, took off his coat, and sat down on the edge of the bed. A slow weariness built up, not physical weariness, but the weariness of someone who had been pushing themselves for long enough. Daniel leaned back, looking up at the ceiling. Am I doing the right thing? Will not getting up today actually help someone else? Those questions weren't meant for self-reproach. They were meant to help me stay honest. He thought of his son. The boy used to ask him very direct questions. "Dad, what should I do if people treat me unfairly?" Daniel once replied. "You have to choose something that makes you want to look in the mirror every morning." Today, he did exactly that. But he also knew that the mirror wouldn't always reflect peace and tranquility. He stood up and stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched out below, noisy and vibrant. The lights were beginning to come on. Another day was drawing to a close. Daniel placed his hand on the railing. A cool breeze touched his skin. At this moment there is no CEO, no flight, no board of directors. Only one man was wondering, how am I going to move forward? The phone vibrated again. This time it was a phone call. The name displayed was Maya Carter. Daniel smiled slightly. He picked up the phone. "It's me," he said. Maya's voice on the other end of the line was warm and familiar. "Are you okay?" she asked without beating around the bush. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm fine," he replied. "But today lasted longer than I expected." Maya paused for a moment. "I watched a short video," she said. "I don't know everything, but I suspect it's related." Daniel looked out at the city. Yes, he said. And no. Would you like to tell me? Maya asked. Daniel thought for a moment. Not now, he said, but I want you to know I didn't get up. Maya didn't answer immediately. Then she spoke in a very soft voice. I know, she said, and I'm proud of you. Daniel closed his eyes. A small, warm feeling spread through his chest. Not the world's approval, but the understanding of the person beside him. Thank you, he said. After hanging up, Daniel stood still for a long time. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. The deal with Thomas Blake would involve meetings, debates, and uncomfortable glances. He also knew that some people would say he was overreacting. Some would say he was abusing his position. And some would wish he had remained silent. But he also knew something else. If you don't do this, you will continue to see the exact same stories as today, only without the name Daniel Carter. Daniel went back into the room, turned off the lights, leaving the city lights behind. He lay down and closed his eyes, not to fall asleep immediately, but to accept that from this moment on he is not just someone who has been treated unfairly. He was the one who chose not to step aside. And that choice, however difficult, was the only thing that allowed him to move forward. Elsewhere, Thomas Blake is preparing for a difficult meeting. Elsewhere, reports are being rewritten, the gears have begun to turn, and Daniel knew that the hardest part of the story was still ahead. Things started spreading not with an explosion but with very small ripples. Daniel Carter woke up the next morning in a quiet hotel room. The early morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, not too harsh, just enough to awaken the city below. He sat up, picked up his phone, and immediately understood that something had changed. It wasn't because there were hundreds of missed calls. It was because there were some very short messages. I just saw your name on Slack. Are you okay about yesterday at JFK? Right? Daniel put down his phone and leaned back against the headboard. He didn't need to read the whole thing to understand. The story had left the airport. It was finding its own way. Elsewhere in the city, Thomas Blake was sitting in a boardroom. No press, no cameras, just stern faces and thick stacks of documents. We need to agree on how to respond, one council member said, before this gets out of control. Thomas placed his hands on the table. This, he said, his voice calm, has spiraled out of control. The question is whether we choose to go with it or be dragged along by it. Another person frowned. Are you talking about collaborating with Daniel Carter? Thomas nodded. It's not just about cooperation, he said. It's about changing the way we perceive these small incidents. A heavy silence followed. Do you understand what precedent that would set? Someone asked. Thomas looked straight ahead. I understand, he said. And I also understand the cost of not opening up. At the same time, an internal meeting was taking place in the Carter and Moore Systems office. Daniel wasn't there, but his name was mentioned in every sentence. We're going to be dragged into this, said a middle manager. The media will ask. Partners will ask. Another person replied, and if we remain silent, they will ask questions too. At the end of the table, Maya Carter sat listening. She didn't speak much. But when she did speak, the room fell silent. Daniel isn't seeking attention, Maya said, but he won't shy away from the truth. She looked around. The question is, are we standing with him? No one answered immediately. In another corner of the city, in a small cafe near the airport, a waiter was watching a short video on his phone. The video was blurry, showing only a man standing next to airport security, his voice low and calm. The comments below are coming in very quickly. He doesn't seem to cause any trouble. Why is it always them? What if he's not the CEO? Those questions are repeated, not simultaneously, not organized, but strangely similar. Daniel stepped out of the hotel and walked a short distance. He wasn't wearing a hat. He wasn't wearing sunglasses. He wasn't trying to hide himself, but he wasn't seeking attention either. On the sidewalk, a middle-aged man looked at him for a few seconds, then approached. Excuse me, he said, hesitating slightly. I'm not sure. But are you the man from the airport yesterday? Daniel paused. Yes, he said. The man nodded. I just wanted to say he said thank you for not shouting. Daniel was slightly surprised. Why? He asked. The man shrugged. Because I've been there, he said. And I shouted, but nobody heard. Daniel nodded. Thank you, he said, for saying that. They parted ways. No communication, no photos, just a very brief moment, but Daniel carried it with him. On social media, posts started appearing. Not from big accounts, but from ordinary people. This happened to me last year. I was also asked to be flexible. I stood up and nobody knew who I was. Those stories didn't mention Daniel Carter much, but his presence was felt in every line. At JFK Airport, David Langley was signing a new series of documents. The process had been updated. The wording had been refined. Words like non-cooperative were being used in a different light. Linda Harper sat at home staring at her suspension email. She reread every line, then opened a blank document, 22 years of work. And for the first time, she wrote a sentence she had never written before. I did it out of habit, not out of fairness. Mark Reynolds sat alone, reviewing the security camera footage from that day. He rewound to the point where Daniel stood up, then paused. Nothing aggressive, nothing disruptive. Only calmness can confuse others. At the train station, Evelyn Whitmore stayed away from social media for a day, then 2 days, but eventually she reopened it, not to search for her name, but to find a more comforting answer. She couldn't find it. Daniel returned to his hotel room in the evening. He opened his laptop and read some articles. He didn't respond. He didn't correct anything. He didn't comment. He only left a few lines. What if he's not the CEO? That question has left the executive office. It's living its own life. Daniel's phone vibrated. A message from Thomas Blake. We'll be announcing the revised framework next week. It's not perfect, but it's real. Daniel typed back a short line. Thank you. Don't stop halfway. He closed his laptop and stepped out onto the balcony. The city was brighter at night than yesterday. Not because of the lights, but because he was looking at it with a different gaze. The ripples spread. They touched strangers. People who had never met Daniel Carter. And he understood that the most dangerous thing was not anger but the breaking of the silence. When silence is no longer an option, every system must take a look at itself. Daniel stood there for a long time, not to enjoy the moment, but to prepare for what was to come. Because he knew that when the ripples had widened enough, there would be a moment when everyone would have to face it. And that moment marks the end of this story. Seat 1A is no longer on the original flight. A week after the JFK incident, that plane had completed several more journeys. Passengers boarded and disembarked. Wine was still poured. Seats were still reclined. No one mentioned that morning aloud. But Seat 1A has changed its meaning. Daniel Carter walked into JFK Airport on another afternoon. No fuss, no escort, no rush. He wore a dark jacket, simple trousers, and his familiar leather shoes. The same figure, the same gait. But in his eyes there was a very different kind of serenity. Not the serenity of someone who had won, but of someone who had finally laid down a heavy burden. Thomas Blake was waiting for him in the boarding area. Not in the meeting room. Not behind closed doors. Right in the common walkway where passengers could see him. Daniel, Thomas said, holding out his hand. Daniel shook his hand. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thomas nodded. We're still learning, he said. But at least, we've started in the right place. They didn't say much more. It wasn't necessary. Daniel handed his ticket to the staff member at the gate. The young woman scanned the code, then looked up at him. Welcome back, she said, smiling. Not flattering. Not curious. Just a genuine greeting. Daniel nodded in response. As he stepped into the airplane cabin, everything felt strangely familiar. The smell of the leather seats. The sound of the overhead compartments closing. The gentle voices of the flight attendants. Seat 1A is there. Drum. Daniel paused for a very brief moment. No one asked him to sit, no one stared at him. This moment belonged to him and him alone. He sat down. There's no feeling of victory. No triumphant music playing in my head. There was only one feeling of peace. I was in the right place. The chief flight attendant approached. It wasn't Linda Harper, someone else, younger, more composed. "Hello, Mr. Carter," she said. "If you need anything, please let me know." Daniel smiled. "Thank you. The plane is preparing for takeoff. The engines are starting. A familiar sound resonates on the floor." Daniel looked out the window. The runway stretched out before him. The city receded in the distance. In that moment he thought of many people. The man who stood beside him at the airport said he had shouted but no one heard. The woman in the cafe recounted how she had been flexible because she didn't want trouble. Those who stood up, who remained silent, who swallowed their feelings of injustice not because they were weak but because they had no safe choice. Daniel thought of Linda Harper. 22 years of work, a bad habit, a belated lesson. He thought of Mark Reynolds, who knew what was right but chose the easy way out, and he thought of Evelyn Whitmore, not with anger, but with the clear realization that the system has allowed choices like hers to exist for far too long without being questioned. The plane began to taxi. Daniel placed his hand on the armrest of the chair. It felt familiar, but this time it wasn't cold. He recalled the question that had been haunting him for days. What if I'm not Daniel Carter? That question remains. It doesn't disappear just because you're sitting in seat 1A. But now, that question is no longer alone. It has been said, heard, repeated by people who have never met him. And that for Daniel was more important than any apology. The flight attendant announced that the plane was preparing for takeoff. Everyone fastened their seatbelts. The lights dimmed. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He didn't pray. He didn't make promises. He only admitted one very simple thing. Seat 1A is not a reward. It is not a symbol of status. It's just a seat. And the only thing that makes it worthwhile is that anyone has the right to sit there if they've done everything right. The plane took off from the ground. The city gradually shrank. The ripples began to subside. But somewhere else in other airports, on other flights, in other cabins, that question is still being asked. Not to cause a disturbance, but to remind you. Daniel opened his eyes. This flight will take him far away, but the story doesn't end here. It will continue every time someone chooses not to stand up when they are in their rightful place. And that's what's most memorable. This story doesn't teach us to be stubborn. It teaches us when not to back down. In life, especially after years of experience, we learn one thing: not all patience is noble. Sometimes silence is the system's way of continuing to hurt people. Daniel Carter didn't win because he was the CEO. He won because he maintained his composure, integrity, and boundaries. The biggest lesson isn't about the bad guys getting punished, but about the very real question: if I have no status, no voice, will justice be on my side? That question forces us to look back at society. But it also forces each person to look back at themselves. How many times have we chosen to stand up even when we knew we were right? Asterisk. How many times have we acted out of habit instead of fairness? Asterisk. And how many times have we remained silent, thinking, let's just get this over with? This story doesn't call for confrontation. It simply reminds us of one very simple thing. Dignity doesn't lie in where we sit, but in whether we dare to sit in the right place. Thank you for taking the time to listen this far. If this story touches on a memory, a pain, or a deep thought within you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Every share you make can help someone else avoid having to get up when they're already in the right place.